So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be love. Love means understanding, redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be love by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be love by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be love and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be love and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be love and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be love and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
Students with King serves as the King Center's flagship engagement platform for elementary, middle, and high school students, highlighting the legacies of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and the impact of the 20th century American Civil Rights Movement. Our dynamic and interactive programming has reached over 1 million students worldwide. Our core learning programs introduce students to the philosophy of Kingian nonviolence, coined Nonviolence 365, and provide important lessons about how they can apply nonviolence in their immediate environments. Whether you're an educator who is looking for ways to bring the King legacy into your classroom, a student who wants to learn more about this powerful moral movement, or a parent who wants to get your child involved in character building and literacy development activities, Students with King is your one-stop shop for unique lesson plans, teaching resources, educational field trips, and other opportunities to engage with the history of the American Civil Rights Movement and its powerful leaders. We look forward to engaging with you and your students. Together we can build the next generation of compassionate, courageous, and conscientious leaders.
There you can you hear me now? As I was saying, we're going to have the QR code come up and scan your QR code because we're going to be taking a survey. If you didn't hear me, let me start again because there's the QR code. That QR code will tell us about your feedback and everything we are talking about. I'm not sure if I was muted or not. It's technicalities. It's live TV, if you will. I'm George Franco, your host for the Students with King Nonviolence Spotlight Series, brought to you by the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia. We're thrilled and honored to have with us Charles Alphin, whose journey in life has taken him from serving as a police officer in St. Louis, Missouri, to working for the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change in many leadership roles. We're going to get to him in just a bit, but for now, we want to go to a video to learn more about this remarkable man.
Welcome to our Students with King Nonviolence Spotlight Series. Today we are going to tell you about an amazing civil rights leader who helped change the world. When you hear his awesome story, it will hopefully spark something in you to make a difference and make your community better for everybody. Our spotlight person is Mr. Charles L. Alphin Sr. He served as a police officer for over 26 years in the St. Louis City Police Department, St. Louis, Missouri. During his police career, he served as a patrol officer, detective, juvenile officer, sergeant, platoon lieutenant, and captain. Serving in the rank of captain the last 10 years of his career, he was commander of homicide and rape and child abuse, and a district commander. And he retired as commander of vice narcotics. In 1992, after retirement from the St. Louis City Police Department, and at the request of Mrs. Coretta Scott King, Captain Alphin and his wife moved to Atlanta to work at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. What an honor! Mrs. Coretta Scott King asked him to work with her. He worked as a trainer in Kingian nonviolence, and in 1994 was promoted to Director of Education and Training for the King Center. In 1996, he retired from the King Center. He has been privileged to train both nationally and internationally in Kingian nonviolence. He has trained law enforcement officers, at-risk and gang youth, educators, elementary, secondary, and college students, professors, community leaders, clergy, and correctional officers. He sure did, and if Mr. Alphin can do all of this, you can too. Presently, he serves as senior trainer for the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia. He also is a conference director and a member of the Global Nonviolence Conference Series.
It's an absolute honor and joy. Mr. Alphin, welcome and thank you for joining us. It's, like I said, a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you, sir. This is a man who has history in his pockets because we were talking earlier, and he has so many stories to tell. I hope we can touch base on all of them and what they mean to you as a young person growing up in this country, especially if you're of color or disadvantaged in any way. Let me start at the beginning with you, sir. How were you introduced to Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and how did that change your trajectory in life? And not just yours, but your family too.
Well, thank you, Josh, for that nice, warm introduction. It's my honor to be here to just discuss some things with a very, very important audience that we're talking to this morning. I met Mrs. Coretta Scott King in 1981. I had been involved with an educational problem with my sons in high school. The high school he was going to had just been desegregated, and the academics of African Americans were not great. The football team had a 1.9 grade point average. My son was a good football player, but the grades were not good in the school. And got involved in that to change the grades, talking to the boards of school. And Dr. Lafayette was in St. Louis, which I didn't know was a lieutenant for Dr. King, and his son was in the same high school. And after we did some work with the school system and changed the whole culture and the grade point average, he took me on a freedom ride in 1981, and that's where I met Mrs. Coretta Scott King in Montgomery, Alabama. And they were having a training at the King Center, and I attended that training in the summertime and changed my life because I thought Dr. King was just turn the other cheek and do nothing and just continue to pray and we'll be okay when we get to heaven. So I had a misinterpretation of Dr. King, and I learned about Dr. King at the King Center and took it back to St. Louis and applied it in the police department as I began to supervise and begin to address the crime in the St. Louis streets.
I found it really interesting that you said that you, at the beginning, were not a fan of Dr. King. Am I getting that right? And tell me why and what it is that changed your mind. And now, not only a fan, you're a teacher of his philosophy, if you will, and his ways of life and nonviolence.
Well, I was an angry African American, and I didn't think Dr. King would change my conditions or the conditions of how other people thought about me. Even in the police department, I met racism, the service, in my community, and I didn't think Dr. King's philosophy would do that. I thought it was more of wait till I get to heaven and heaven to be okay, because I was in church and believed in as a Christian, had divine order, but I didn't think that would work with people who hated you and were trying to kill you. So therefore, I appreciate what Dr. King was doing. I just wasn't a follower of Dr. King. And what changed my mind was on the Freedom Rides, we reinterpreted Freedom Rides. And I had Andrew Young and Honorable Andrew Young and John Lewis and Dorothy Cotton and John Bevel and Diane Nash and all these great people around me, Dr. Lafayette. And they began to tell me how they changed the whole South and the voting rights and didn't shoot anybody and didn't violate anybody's humanity. And I was just taken by that, and I was like a sponge. So I wanted to learn, how do you do that? And my way of solving problems was taking, a stick or a weapon. I belonged to gangs and I was violent. I've done some things I'm ashamed of, but they told me a new way, and I just sat and listened, and it made sense. I practiced with my family. I took it home to my family first, because sometimes we're more violent to people we say we love with our mouth and the way we talk. So I began to internalize it and just kept reading it and began to practice it, experiment with it, people that didn't like me, and et cetera, et cetera. And then now I'm a teacher and understand and totally believe in it because of what the King Center taught me about Dr. King and what they call Kenyan nonviolence. Now it's been branded by Dr. Bernice King as Nonviolence 365, which you use it every day, 365.
Absolutely. You spoke of being an angry African American. I saw the video about you and kind of your life story. And you spoke of that just a little while ago as you've been speaking, but speak to the young people watching. You got past your anger and you found a different path with Kingian philosophy and teachings. How do you ask people to look inside themselves, these young people who are watching us? What do you advise them to do with their own anger?
Well, in the training at the King Center, we teach people, how do you direct your anger? Dr. King got angry because they were sicking dogs on people and had tanks and tried to kill him. He was angry, but he understood, how do you direct your anger? And you direct your anger so it becomes positive energy and not negative energy. Because when you get angry, you're probably going to do something emotional and not what you really want to do. So what you want to do is make sure that you direct your anger to out of your body, so you don't harbor that anger. And I was very mad at people, and I was harboring anger. I didn't know how to direct that anger. So that taught me how to direct your anger so it can become positive and not destructive. That's the first thing. And then they have rules of behavior in the 6 principles Dr. King laid out. And we don't have time to do it now, but there's 6 principles. And that's the guardrail. When you try to change people, change society, when you operate with these 6 principles that Dr. King said. I had been in a lot of training and race relations, diversity training, but it always told me to do good. It didn't tell me how to be good. So Kenyan nonviolence says, if you want to practice like Dr. King, here are the rules. Like in football and baseball, you have rules, and you can't violate these rules as you do your actions. So that was what excited me. And then I tried it with my wife and my children. And you don't realize how sometimes you're violent to the people you say you love by the way you talk to people, the way you relate to them, especially those people in your house. And when I found out it worked in my house, I took it to my job and to the police department. And now I'm wholly sold out on the whole philosophy. And it's either nonviolence or non-existence, because we have the potential to destroy this whole world.
Yes, sir. And if you're watching from wherever you're watching and whatever school you're at, thank you for joining us. And we also invite you to ask the questions in chat, because I'm sure, as a gentleman myself from a different generation, these young people, we didn't grow up with the technology that they have today, Mr. Alphin. So they've got a different perspective. Do you want to talk about that different perspective? And what do you think about the way information is disseminated just instantly right now? And how does that affect the movement of nonviolence, or does it affect that?
Absolutely. Nonviolence takes people of goodwill to move. And Dr. King was a strategist, and he could get to the media. As you know, back then, George, the media was 6 o'clock news was a great news on television. And so Dr. King made sure that everything he did hit the 6 o'clock news. So they demonstrated in the morning. Now it's news 24/7. The television, when I came up, went off at 11 o'clock and didn't come back on until 6. But now it's 24/7. And also, there's a lot of people who have using the media to shape your thinking, because a lot of misinformation is on that social media on purpose. A lot of international countries are using the media to excite problem between races, et cetera. And a lot of that information is misinformation. So therefore, they're bombarded with a lot of more news than we were, because something had happened in the United States and we wouldn't know about it because the media didn't cover it. It wasn't covered like this. So therefore, we need the young people to understand how the game is played, and then give us a response to that game, because they know social media and they can advertise very well with social media. All we have to do is let them understand that you can use it to benefit your issue, but don't get caught up in that noise, because there's a lot of misinformation and people who have different agendas to persuade your mind, to feed you wrong information so you act out differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's hope that that misinformation can be somehow managed, and that young people can see through that. Speaking of information, and I don't know what the latest is, but no doubt you heard what happened in Kansas City after the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, and then they had this celebration, and then now we've got mayhem and death on our hands. So any thoughts on Kansas City?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to offer my really concern, condolences, and prayers to all the people who are affected. You know, George, when we see a violent incident, and I found out that when I was in homicide, violence is like you throwing a pebble in a lake. It has ripples out both sides, because even those people who were not shot or killed or traumatized, and they saw something that's out of the norm, and they'll never forget it. Those people who were close to being shot, who were running for their lives, all that's been affected. So we have to look broader than just the people who got injured or shot. We certainly want to offer our prayers for them, but there's a lot of things that we don't see that affect people, that they'll never get over it because of what they saw. So it's trauma. Even those people who are going to recover from bullet wounds, it's going to take a long time for them to recover. So that violence is a rippling effect. And then there's people that did wrong, and they have mothers and fathers who will be visiting them in the penitentiary the rest of their lives. So it bothers their lives. People who don't have money to travel to prison, et cetera, to see their loved ones. So we're to think a little broader about this. So I just offer my condolences and prayers to the whole atmosphere, the whole community. And I like what Mahomes said when and other people, football players. But that's a tragedy, and it just breaks my heart to see that type of trauma with people who came to enjoy a football game. And it's just not a football game, George. It's a rally. It's in church. It's in the movie. You know, it's all over where people, I'm not sure if they're angry, or certainly the accessibility of guns has something to do with it, but that's not all. But we need to have that type of common sense gun control. But our young people need to get on that. I like what the Parkland people did, the youngsters. They went to Congress, and they're actively in protesting and in Congress, and they're actually trying to change that. So I think if we as a community got together and went to Washington like Dr. King did, because Dr. King understood that Washington does not run the world or the United States, the people. And a democracy is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And we send people to Washington to represent us. And when they don't represent us, we need to bring them back home in love and say, we love you, but you cannot represent us. So I think that the way that we get out of this is begin to look at who we put in Washington, how we vote, who we vote for, and make sure we're sending people to Washington to represent us, because it's of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Absolutely. And right now is a good time to remind you, our viewers, that if you haven't registered to vote, and you can't because you're too young, but when you get to be of that age, 18 years old, and you can register to vote, do so. Do so that your voice will be heard. And what Dr. Alphin is talking about, how voices change society, society follows the vote. And speak a little bit more, because as a police officer, you said that, if I understand this right, that police officers don't make laws, they enforce laws, and that the officers follow the laws that are created by society, if you will. Speak a little bit more about how you learned that from your experience as a police officer and what you're doing with the King Center.
Well, in '65, policing was ultimate power. The politician gave the police the power. We had to go to a politician and pay money to join the police department. And that was strictly politician power. And then the system said that they didn't like that kind of power. When I was young, I was beaten by the police, and police had nobody complained. There was no such thing as police brutality. But the people changed that. The laws changed. When I was coming up in '65 as a police officer, we didn't have to get search warrants. We would kick the door in and say, police. Now the Supreme Court ushered in and said you can't search and seizure, and you can't go in people's houses. So all those laws were put on restrictions of the police behavior. So therefore, the people you send to Washington make the laws for the police officers. And so when you talk about policemen not behaving right, then you need to go and look at your city council, your mayor. The police chief works for the mayor. And most state laws are governed by the governor, not the president of the United States. So therefore, when you want to have transparency and police officers being treated right with humanity, you need to deal with your local people, your governor, your mayor, and the police chief is appointed by the mayor. The mayor is elected. So in a democracy, the power is in the ballot. And I was told, like, Dr. King understood that. That's why he worked with Washington, the right to vote. And in fact, he wrote a speech in 1957, said, give us the ballot, and talked about how in a democracy we could change this. But we cannot change it by not participating. And those of you who are not old enough to vote, tell your parents what you've heard. Make sure your parents go to vote. Harold Washington, the mayor of Chicago, won the election because the students told their parents that couldn't vote that you need to get out and vote for Harold Washington. So 13-year-old or younger people, tell your parents how important voting is, and make sure they go to the polls and vote. That's what they can do. And those of you who are old enough to vote, make sure you read the platform, look at what people are offering to do for you, and then vote your conscience.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this. We spoke before we went on the air that there's such a thing as the Kingian philosophy of nonviolence and the Kingian issues of how nonviolence and Dr. Martin Luther King grew to be this movement now, if you will. Can you explain a little bit more about this philosophy in your life? And also, as a police officer, did that change you then? And is that what brought you to Atlanta?
Well, in studying Dr. King's philosophy, I found out all the things I didn't know about Dr. King. I thought he was a great man, a minister, but I didn't know that his philosophy was universal. His philosophy about relationship with humanity. His philosophy about treating people with respect. So I had no idea all that was embodied in the philosophy of Kingian nonviolence. So when I began to study it, it's holistic. It's the way people relate to other people. So therefore, Dr. King was saying, in this life as we live, we're all connected to one another. And what affects you directly affects me indirectly. And we saw that with COVID, when we had a virus in China and affected the whole world. So we just can't live in isolation and say, this is my country. We're a part of the human race.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I'm going to talk to Mike, who's our director backstage, and let's ask Mike to put up the QR code right now and get some of the young folks who are watching to scan the QR code and also give us some of the feedback, because with your feedback, there are certain procedures that need to take place for for the King Center to continue on with the teachings of the King Way, the nonviolence, if you will. And that is why we need your feedback, so that we have a roadmap to the future. And you're all part of this future. And if you've never been to the King Center in Atlanta, do yourself a favor and stop in and learn personally from the teachings and the great archives and all the visual elements. You won't be disappointed. I think it'll enlighten you a little further. So with that, hopefully you've got a little bit of time to scan that QR code, and let's get back to Mr. Alphin. And I've got a question, because I keep, I guess, going back to your history as a police officer, because on the one hand, I understand that police officers have to have restraint. And if an officer goes rogue, i.e. George Floyd, then what happens to other officers? But also, how does a police officer like yourself carry a weapon and declare himself or herself nonviolent? I don't know if that applied to you at that time, but today that's a real relevant question.
That's an excellent question. And I, first of all, say that nonviolence is your choice. Just like violence is your choice. Gandhi said you always have other alternatives of violence. And when you use violence, that's your choice. So therefore, you have to suffer the consequences. So therefore, as a police officer, I had to wear a weapon because it's part of my uniform. If you don't carry a weapon in the police department, you can't go on the streets. That's a part of your uniform. But just because it was part of my uniform, it didn't, my mind told me when to use my gun. So they couldn't tell me when to use it. I had to wear it. So I've never shot at anybody. I've been shot at least 8 times. And everybody that tried to kill me, I use other alternatives to apprehend them. So my doctrine says that killing is not right. And so I just choose not to kill, and I choose to enforce the law and apprehend people who tried to hurt me. But violence is your choice, and I look for alternatives. So therefore, I would carry a weapon, but the department said carry it, but I made the decision when I used it, and I've never shot at anybody with my weapon.
Thank God for that. I'm glad you got through without any major injuries. Did you have any kind of post-traumatic from being an officer? Did you find yourself that you said, I need to debrief, I need to decompress after this life and then change gears? Tell me about that process, because you went from a very high stressful position that you were the enforcer to a position of leadership with the King Center that spoke of nonviolence. And that's quite the shift.
Yeah, well, the good thing is that I teach police officers, and they receive this very well, because most police officers do this out of just being a human being. And they didn't know what to call it, nonviolence. But when you codify it and put it in motion, so therefore we have bad police officers, and we are trying to get them out of the system, like we have bad teachers and bad ministers, bad news people, you know. So therefore, we can use this, and I'm all over the world teaching nonviolence with police officers. But what has to happen with police officers and also the community and your mind, when you're in a police car, you see too much, and your mind, your brain takes a picture of all that. And I've seen most of my homicide victims, especially children, and I can see children that I saw in the morgue, and I can see them in Atlanta or when I walk, and I still see that child, the makeup of that child, because it bothers you. So yes, I had to decompress. So I think what helped me is that when I was in the police department, seeing all the bad things I saw, I switched my life, George, and I worked with young people. I was a baseball coach, football coach, basketball, and I was the president of over 5,000 Corey League young people. And so I changed it from that stress every day, seeing all the bad things in people's lives and killing, to life, which were young people playing baseball. And I involved myself with them. I think you just can't keep that stress on you, like you said. You know, you'll go out of contract with yourself as a human being. You lose contact with the humanity in you. So I had to switch from policing 8 hours a day and then going to doing something else. I always tell police officers, put your weapon down and do something with people. Serve some people. Just don't stay a police 24 hours. Some police officers do 8 hours of work and then they go to a party and all they talk about is police work with their family. that's not good for you. So you have to have some outlet to let that mind get off and let you see some good in life. Because when people call you, there's a crisis, and you just can't go every day 24/7 seeing people calling you for issues that really affect your mind. So you have to have a relief valve. My relief valve was working with young people in correlated baseball, football, and basketball.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. And, in defense of many, many police officers, there's such things as Police Athletic League, PAL. And one of the reasons I got out of the news, you're right, I was kind of to there with all the bad news. And I'm not going to bite the hand that feeds, but it is what it is. But you're right, to give back is important. And I think that's a great message for the young people, that as you grow up and you give back to society and you give back to others, you learn more about yourself. Here's an interesting question from Instagram. What's the difference between nonviolence, one word, nonviolence, and non/violence, using a hyphen? Is there a difference in the word?
That's an excellent question. The hyphen confuses people, because when we hyphenate a word in English language, it means lack of the essential ingredient in the specified word, like non-alcoholic, lack of alcohol, non-organization, lack of organization. That's not what Dr. King was talking about. Dr. King ushered in the word non-violence without the hyphen is a noun, descriptive. It's a method of art that brings about complete change. It is not the opposite of violence. It's the cure to violence. Nonviolence cures violence. It is not the opposite. Nonviolence without the hyphen cures violence. It is not the opposite of violence. Just like salt vaccine cures polio, it's not the opposite of polio. So therefore, when you spell nonviolence in Dr. King, you never use a hyphen. I've been to some Ivy League colleges that spell with a hyphen. That is incorrect. It is a noun. So therefore, it's not the opposite, it's the cure.
So if I can kind of rephrase this for my own edification, and I hope it helps the young people, non-violence with the hyphen then speaks more of a vacuum of something missing. Non-violence, one word, speaks of a movement in itself. Is that a fair assumption?
Absolutely. It's holistic, and it's changing. It changes situation in the nonviolent process. Absolutely. You got it right. That's
Amen. Amen. I think that's a wonderful description. I saw that, and to be honest, I never thought about the hyphen or not. But now that I see it, I'll remember it each and every time. You also said that.
George, let me add just a little bit more because this is a smart audience. Now, Gandhi brought it in, ushered in nonviolence through ahimsa. Ahimsa means doing no harm to any living being. Mm-hmm. And that's where the hyphen came from, because ahimsa says you don't violate and don't hurt anybody. Ahimsa, that's a religion, basically with the Jain religion. So do some study on that, young people, and find out, boy, it's very interesting. Once you start reading, you can't stop. But Gandhi had the ahimsa, which was doing no injury to any living being. And Dr. King didn't take the ahimsa completely like that. He took nonviolence because that's a way of life.
Oh boy, I could see a teacher out there hoping, and maybe they hear this, thinking that, you know what, for my students, that's a great paper. Write up a description of nonviolence with the hyphen, without the hyphen, what it means, where it came from. There's so much out there now that I bet they could do research pretty quickly and come up with some really interesting thoughts. That's fascinating. Now that you put it that way, it means a lot. It's a different impression of what it is. So I thank you for that. And thank you for the question. If you have any more questions, please direct it our way, because we want to hear not just from me. I can talk to this gentleman all day long because he's so fascinating, but I'm curious to know from you, the young people watching us, what's your perspective on nonviolence? How does it work into your life? How do you speak about it? Do you speak about it with your family, with your friends? That's what we're talking about, moving this movement forward. And Mr. Alphin has been such an integral part of moving it in the direction of our history moving forward over his years. But the next generation also has to continue passing that torch. Speak about that, Mr. Alphin, about continuing that message and how you go from one generation to the next, because we're going into the next generation. And sadly, we lost Dexter King. but nobody's going to be around forever.
Well, yes, and that's what I like what you said, George, because the people we're talking to now, they're the only future we have. They're it. And we've done a bad job, George, on violence. The 20th century was the most violent century in the history of man and womankind. And we've got nuclear weapons that can destroy this world 10 times. And like Dr. King said, it's now nonviolence or non-existent. So therefore, we've got to pass this on. That's what Mrs. King did. Mrs. Coretta Scott King built the King Center after Dr. King was assassinated. And she wanted to make it a living legacy for the young people. She built it for the people we're talking about. And so it's there. And she wanted to make sure this legacy continued. And 5 hours before Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis hotel, he told Dr. King told Dr. Lafayette that our next movement is to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence. So he saw the vision, George, of taking it international and then institutionalizing it, meaning that you put it into an organization, that the organization continues to teach this, like in teacher education. In police departments, we teach police departments in the academy to teach nonviolence. Like they practice firearms, you practice nonviolence. So it's institutionalized. And that's where we're headed, so that this next generation understand, how do you solve your problem without dropping bombs on females and killing children and wrapping around the inhumanity and genocide? So therefore, there has to be another way. And we're smart people. We can go to the moon, and we can make all these smartphones. I don't even know how to act, man, and work most of my smartphones. We're smart. We can figure this out. But we need these people, the people we're talking to. We need them to understand their connection with humanity and how we can make this a better world.
Absolutely. And we want to reach out to you, the students watching us today. A couple of things. Viewers from classrooms in Kansas City of all places, New Haven, Connecticut are watching us today. And so, Mr. Alphin, we've got young people from all over the country watching them. Look to them and tell them about what you just spoke about a little bit. And let me kind of connect some of the dots also, because when you were a police officer, I suppose later you said that you can't have a jury when an officer stops you on the street. Speak about that, and what do you mean by that? Because as a police officer, you have the duty, obligation, and enforceability for life and death. It's the ultimate power, if you will.
Yeah, and that's a great question, because policemen have that power, and it has to be monitored. When I was in supervision, I monitor behavior of police officers. So therefore, as we teach this philosophy, we also teach people how to negotiate a car stop when a policeman stops you, and what causes that danger to go, that red flag to go up, and that resistance with police officers, and how can you de-escalate a relationship with an officer. So therefore, we give you just common sense. When an officer stops you and you're in a car and you've got 4 people in there and it's dark, that officer has safety on his mind. And so you have to do things that eliminate that officer's fear, that safety. A car stopping a car and going in people's houses is the most dangerous thing you can do as a police officer. So that flag goes up, that danger flag goes up when you get a domestic call for going to people's homes, because you don't know what they have in their homes. So therefore, when an officer stops you, just make sure you don't play like you on TV. Just make sure that they see your hands, and that you don't have your cell phone in your hand, because that cell phone can look like a gun, and that you don't challenge the officer as far as what he's doing to you, because you can't win on the street. If an officer is rude to you or talks to you like you're out of character, then you want to get away from that relationship, that contact, as soon as possible, and you want to file a complaint. You definitely want to file a complaint, but you don't try to have court or jury on the street with a police officer. You're going to lose every time. They're going to give you tickets, they're going to tow your car, and some of them will lie on you in a police report. So therefore, you don't want to have that confrontation with a person of that power on the street, but you do want to file a complaint. When you file a complaint against the police officer, it has to be signed, and it lets us as supervisors know, George, that we have a problem and we should monitor that police officer. We have what they call a red flag on police behavior. And when we see, George, if you have so many resistings in a month or a year, we can pull you in, George, and say, what are you doing on the street that's causing those resistance? But if you don't complain, then the supervisor never know about it until something big blows up. So therefore, every police agency has an internal affairs, and you can complain to the police, the internal affairs. Don't just talk to your friends and get mad. Help us to get those bad officers that are not functioning as they should as a police officer. Help us get them off the street. And that's what you can do, but never make that confrontation on the street. Get away from that officer. You don't have to get his badge number. You don't have to get his name. On that car, there's a number. And we started that in the 60s. Look at that car number and just get the number. And if you identify the number, we can put that person in that car with a computer, because the computer tracks that car and knows everybody's in that car. So you don't have to get your name and what's your badge number. Just look at the number, get the car number, that number on the fender or on the back of that police car, and then report it.
Let me ask you this, because everything you say is absolute crystal clarity for me right now as a man who's, in his 60s now. But it takes a lifetime to kind of learn so much of this. How do you reach a young person who understandably might have a different impulse, might have a different dynamic, might have a different temperament, that they don't think about it? They just react and they instantly go off. How do you get to those kids?
Well, the philosophy helps you practice it. It becomes second nature. Now, I used to dislike a set of people, and now I don't dislike anybody. So it's that reading of it, it's that training your mind and your spirit, and then you react as second nature. So it's practice. And then it's also understanding the consequences. When you let your ego or your macho get into you and you do some things to an officer, you've got to get a lawyer. You may go to jail. You're going to pay a ticket. So look at the consequences and ask yourself, are the consequences worth me doing this just because of my little ego? And I think you always say it's not worth it, because once you get in that criminal justice system, it's hard. So you want to stay out of that criminal justice system. And then don't just take it because they're violating you. Complain. That your way out is get out of that contact and then go to internal affairs and make a complaint against that officer. It will help us, because we look at those complaints that come in against officers, and it helps the supervision to get rid of those people who should not be police officers.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Let me talk to the young people watching us right now. We've got some folks, as we said, from Kansas City, New Haven, Connecticut. Please, if you're watching and you're in a classroom or otherwhere else, I think these are sent to schools, but maybe somebody else is watching somewhere else. Send us a comment. Send us your location. Send us why you're watching. Send us what you want to learn. Send us what it is about this nonviolence movement that you think can improve your community. So with that, let me ask you what to share, if you have some difficult memories during the civil rights movement that you think nonviolent knowledge would have helped you resolve back then. Because the one thought that comes to mind is the quote, "good trouble," from the now gone Congressman John Lewis. I take it you knew Congressman Lewis, no doubt you knew him.
Yes, I knew John Lewis. I met and trained me at the King Center. Mrs. King brought in all those people around Dr. King, and I was privileged, Joyce, to listen and talk to them and just understand John Lewis and all the people that you read in the history books. So yes, Mrs. King would bring, every year we'd have 1 week of training at the King Center, and they brought young students from all over the world, really. And we sat and listened to those icons, those legends, and boy, it really helped me. So it's courage. The first thing nonviolence takes is courage. It takes you to submit your macho and your ego, but you have to be courageous. And I learned how to be. I learned how courageous was. There's a moral courage and there's a physical courage. So it takes courage. And then once you get it, you find out, boy, this is easy, because I can see situations that I could have done differently, that I was a part of the problem. Dr. King always asked himself, in a conflict, when these students get into conflict at school, ask yourself, what part did you play? What percentage did you play in the conflict? Was it 5%? Was it 10%? So you always challenge yourself, what could I have done differently? What could I have done different? Could I have spoken up? Silences. Dr. King said he's more afraid of people of silence than he was the Ku Klux Klan. So are you silent when you see something? So all these things say, how did I contribute to this conflict? And just ask yourself questions, and then see the next time, just do it better. And before long, you'll be doing it second nature.
Absolutely. And here's another question from Instagram. I'm not quite sure how to interpret it, so I will read it exactly as it is written. Should traffic stop curriculum be changed?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I'll give you a response. Traffic enforcement saves lives. It's been proven. I don't know if you know it. When we could only travel 55 miles an hour because of gas shortage on the highway, traffic deaths went down. So therefore, excuse me, traffic enforcement saves lives. Now, traffic enforcement can be abused because you need probable cause to stop a person. And normally police will use a burnout tail light or illuminated license plates to stop you to see if you're carrying anything illegal. That's where it's abusive, traffic stops. So therefore, it has to be monitored. We had to write down profile who we've stopped because blacks and some other races get profiled because of who they think they are. So we had to write down, stop, who are you stopping? It has to be controlled. But in general, speed, enforcement of traffic violations reduce the accidents and the homicides and the traffic fatalities. So therefore, I would say, yes, we need that, but it has to be controlled and it has to be monitored so that people who have power don't abuse it by saying you have a tail light that's burned out or your license plate is illuminated just for an excuse to search your car or to stop you.
Absolutely. Okay. We're waiting for another question or two to come in from our students watching across the country. And thank you for joining us as we speak to Mr. Alphin, who is a senior leader with the King Center, and his wisdom and insight has gone far in this morning. So if you have any other questions, please let us know. What do you think Mrs. Coretta Scott King would advise us today? If she were still around, what would she be saying?
Wow, Mrs. King was consistent and persistent and passionate with this philosophy. I've never seen, she was unusual, very unusual. She would say that you have the power, that you don't let anybody identify or describe how far you can go in life or what you can be. She had a strong father, and she could pick cotton. They said she was at 14 years old. She could pick a bag of cotton of a grown person. So she was a worker lady. She was work and understood, was not afraid of work. And we always said she had a fifth child. She had 4 childs, by Dr. King, and then a 5th child was the King Center. She loved the King Center. She and Mrs. Farris, Dr. King's sister, the 2 of them ran the King Center. So what she would say would to practice Dr. King's philosophy, use it every time, your relationship with human beings, and then help change some situations that you see in your community that you think should be changed. So she was an activist. She didn't marry, she was not just Dr. King's wife. They were a pair, and she was doing activity and activism long before she met Dr. King. So she would say, keep doing what you know is right, and keep helping people, and think outside yourself.
Absolutely. And from what I heard, she was quite the songbird too. She had a voice and that she could sing well.
Yes, and she would go in Montgomery. She would travel around north, and she would raise money in concerts to benefit the Montgomery bus boycott. So she contributed to the money by her talent of singing. Absolutely.
Oh, that's wonderful. What do you have a challenge, or do you have a challenge for the young people watching today? We've got a few more minutes, but we're kind of coming up on closing time. So what's your challenge?
Well, I think the young people today, we need your help. We need you to understand this philosophy and update it to your vocabulary and how people can understand what Dr. King was talking about. Our young people teach other young people much better than we do. Their vocabulary, their understanding, their culture, etc. So we need them to study this, make sure it's genuine, and then update this so that people their age can understand how this is not a do nothing activity. This is, if you do nothing, you're not practicing Kenyan nonviolence. Dr. King said nonviolence is aggressive, organized goodwill. It has to be aggressive toward evil. It has to be organized, and it has to be for the goodwill of your opponent. So therefore, I challenge you to, number one, learn from the King Center, stay in touch with the networks and the virtuals, et cetera, and then help us transfer this and update it to 2024 so that people can receive it, understand it, and then do some action with it. That would be my challenge. And also, number one is to make sure you participate in government. What does that mean? That means you vote. Participating in government means you vote. And Dr. King said, give us the ballot. He wrote a speech in 1957. The most strongest thing you can do in nonviolence is to vote. Dr. King said it's one of the most strongest. Nonviolence is one of the things you can do in nonviolence is to participate and vote. So my challenge would be, number one, to study, stay with the King Center, be a transformation person, and not just a person that goes along to get along.
Yes, sir. And we've got another question. What does internal affairs do to protect those who make a report not to be subject to retaliation or harassment?
That's an excellent question, because those are always possibilities that you can be harassed or retaliate. But the system has a point of protecting you also, because once you become a witness, you have some support, because the system does not look lightly on people who are intimidated if they're a witness. So therefore, you have protection the person when you make the report. If you get harassment or retaliation, just report it back. And most people know that I'll stay away from that person that reported on me, because that's a danger sign with the criminal justice system. And they do have witness protections. But if you get somebody retaliates against you, make sure you go back to internal affairs and report it, because there's systems and people and laws that protect you once you become a witness. So, and then what you're doing, you're helping other people, because that officer, probably not the first time he or she did something. So what you're doing, you're protecting other people from going through the same experience that you went through. And it takes a little courage, but don't be afraid of it, because the system does have some processes that will protect you.
Amen. And following up on that, somebody who lives in Atlanta and somebody who has access to the King Center has all kinds of resources at their disposal. But to those who don't have those resources at their disposal, to smaller communities, to other communities, are there generally community activists or organizations that are available for people to reach out to? Because I've been in a lot of different cities covering different news: Albuquerque, Atlanta, San Jose, and every community I've ever been at has a community activist, an organization, something like that. Any information or advice to people on who to reach out to if you can't find somebody?
Well, number one, I think you can always find somebody online. The kingcenter.org, that's the way to go, because they can direct you with literature, readings, Italian networks like we're doing now, other students, the beloved Community Leadership Academy. They have all types of things that can connect you. And I would be careful in communities, because people will call it Kenyan nonviolence, but it's not really Kenyan nonviolence. So I would be careful not to. I would stay with the King Center and let the King Center direct you as to and serve you, because they've got all types of outlet programs and participatory things that you can do and read. And then they have an e-learning program. They have all types of things that can engage you and get you started, and then direct you in the right direction. So I would stick to the kingcenter.org and just deal with that and ask all the questions you want. Somebody will get back to you from the King Center and direct you, so you don't go down a rabbit trail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm speaking from the non-tech point of view, that we would find people in different ways. But now with this and the kingcenter.org, there is a lot of resources, and they're much more available than they were in the past. Let me just kind of ask you this: working for the King Center impacted you in your life. Can you kind of give us a sum up of how it changed your choices in life and your decisions that you've made?
Oh, wow. I think just seeing something that was successful. You see, I had been fighting and angry, but it wasn't changing anything. And I was being nasty to people. It didn't change anything. And when I saw the success, how Dr. King and his other people changed this world, didn't shoot anybody, didn't violate anybody's humanity, and changed this world, I thought, wow, that's a success. So what attracted me was that I was angry, 39 years old, and hadn't done a lot of successful things in life to change anything. So therefore, when I saw and read about the success stories, you know, what I mean by success stories, the greatest legislation passed in that 19th century was the Montgomery, the bus desegregation. It was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in Birmingham, and it was the Voting Rights Act in Selma. And those three gigantic legislation were enacted through nonviolence. The gun and the AK-47 didn't produce those types of legislation that protected us. So I guess what changed me is I saw success. I was realistic. I was logical. Okay, I've done this and I haven't seen success. Now I see this, I see success. I see all the people around me. I see a methodology that it's my choice to use it. So that's one what really attracted me was I could see some movement, success, and some growth. Now we're not where we ought to be. So thank God we're not where we used to be.
Yes, sir. We've got another student question, I believe it is. As states are preventing the teaching of Black history and AP classes, how do you suggest Black history can be carried on to younger generations?
Oh, wow. These are some excellent questions. And that is a very, very important question because the people who forget their history do to repeat it. And in 1981, Mayor Arrington in Birmingham, Alabama said, if we're not careful, the clock can be turned back. And George, as I see things now in the political world, the clock is being turned back because it's going back to the 60s. So therefore, we have to protect and make sure our history is correct. Because I always use history, George, in studying this. History is his story, HISRY, his story. And I've traveled in Africa, all over the world, and his story has been false a lot of times about our history. So therefore, we need to know our history. We have to know our history. And we have to know, I'm not call Black history, but American history, because American history is Black history. So therefore, we have to get into our school boards. They have people that are getting on school boards now that think the diversity and inclusion is not good. But we have to, number one, watch our local school boards, look at our local government, look at our governor, look at the politicians, look at the issues that they're voting on, get involved in the government. And you don't have to be old to get involved. At 13 or 14, you can go and sit in and listen to the laws that are being passed and then help them understand that these laws are not good for the country. When you don't study Black history, other people don't understand who you are. So it affects the whole culture. And I think that we can do everything we can to keep our history clean, make it knowledgeable, because I didn't know before I came in, George, my history. And I went to all Black school. I knew a lot about it. They told me Columbus discovered America. And then when I got reading after I got out of college, he didn't discover America, but that's what I thought. So therefore, we have to be careful and understand our history because it's very, very important. In fact, the people that don't understand your history, you're doomed to repeat it. So we've got to get in those local school boards, get in those city councils, get in that mayor and make sure that they understand the value of history and how it can uplift and lift up the whole United States of America when we understand each other.
Thank you so much. And we've come to the point of the program where it's time to wrap it up. And we want to remind you who are watching, the students watching, to when it's your time to register to vote and when it's your time, vote and get your voice heard. And Mr. Alphin, we want to say thank you for your words of wisdom and your knowledge and your kindness and your be love message and the message of nonviolence. It's been a wonderful thing. And one more time, we've got a QR code that's going to come up one more time. I understand that we've got the QR code. So if you're the student watching, you can scan the QR code. You can go to the King Center. And believe me, if you have questions and concerns like we were talking about, go to the King Center, kingcenter.org, and ask your questions there. I have been to the King Center many times, and it is my absolute honor and privilege to help them spread the message of love and nonviolence. So with that, we want to say words of wisdom from a man who has traveled a road, Mr. Alphin, that few of us will ever know. Thank you so much for your time. And come back to me now, if you will, on camera. My name is George Franco, your host today. And let me leave you with the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. Thank you, everybody, and make it a great day.
Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the world when he demonstrated what could be achieved through nonviolence. Now, you can learn how to live and practice this philosophy yourself through Nonviolence 365 Online, an innovative digital experience developed by the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Nonviolence 365 Online features extensive video interviews with real nonviolence practitioners, including the King Center CEO Dr. Bernice A. King, King Center certified instructors and trainers, and veterans of the civil rights movement. Explorations of the historic campaigns that helped Dr. King forge his philosophy. Immersive, annotated reading experiences that enhance Dr. King's most influential writings on nonviolence. Custom activities, including quizzes and interactive scenarios to help you practice along the way. Real-world exercises to help you start applying nonviolence in your daily life. Nonviolence 365 is a love-centered way of thinking, speaking, engaging, and acting that leads to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. It isn't just a concept for philosophers or political leaders. Nonviolence 365 is a powerful, practical approach to dealing with conflict and dismantling injustice. Whether it's in your personal life, in your school or workplace, your local community, or a national movement. Dr. King, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and many others sought to create the beloved community, a society built on global cooperation and equity. This wasn't a lofty utopian dream. It's a realistic and achievable goal because each and every one of us has the power to make it happen by committing to nonviolence as a way of life. Take the first step today with Nonviolence 365 Online.